Welcome to another episode. Today, I'm joined by one of the OG builders in Interop and the co-founder of Everclear. Like before starting, I just want to say I've literally followed your work for the last 4 years, and I deeply respect whatever you've done for this space. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Arjun. I really appreciate that. And I want to say likewise, like I think the amount of work that you have put into educating the space is really, really fantastic.
I would honestly say like it's a lot of it comes a lot from your work because I've learned literally the basics of the space from you. So like I'm not trying to like go overboard in terms of the places, but it is a fact because I feel like when you started the space was very new, right? So when I joined there were not a lot of people to follow. So a lot of the initial building blocks, the educational material came from you and the Connext team. So there's no exaggeration in that statement.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I was like looking at the bottom of this to figure out like, is there a way for me to send heart emojis? It's not a Google Meet, unfortunately.
Awesome. So, I mean, you are one of the first builders in the interop space, right? So, you've been here for almost 5 years. I would love to get
Yeah.
your read on the interop ecosystem today, right? Like, where do you think we are today in the space?
Yeah, it's crazy to think it's been that long. Actually, so I started working in this space back in 2016, and like at the time I was working on scalability, and so like, but at the same time, what I've kind of learned is that like scalability and interop are basically just like two sides of the same coin. They're really the same fundamental problem. Like, the first paper on rollups that was written by John Adler was called "Trustless Two-Way Bridging to Sidechains by Halting." And it was just the first rollup spec was just a bridging spec, which is crazy, right? It's like really awesome that we've that a lot of this is like its origins in the same place, but it's also sometimes a little sad that like we haven't necessarily made as much progress as quickly as we wanted to. I mean, I would say in general, like I feel like this space has certainly made a lot of progress in terms of the tooling becoming a lot more mature. So like when we first started, so Connext kind of first like went live as a bridging product back in like 2020 to 2021. And when we first started, the main kind of concern was around like hacks, right? Because everybody was just doing everything custodially, and like it was all a shit show, and like the level of sophistication was extremely low, and the risk was extremely high because bridging got PMF almost instantly, right? As an industry and like as a category, it's like one of the fastest growing market categories in the space of all time, and like. We went from like nobody is even thinking about bridging to like this is many billions of dollars are flowing through this on a monthly basis, basically in like a few months, and like that was just a disaster waiting to happen. And then that disaster did happen like a bunch of times over and over again. I would say like one thing that is really good is that seems to have slowed down a lot. Right? There haven't been any touch wood, lots of wood. There have not been any huge bridge hacks in the last like year for at least not to the same extent as we saw in the last cycle. I think a big part of that is just like sophistication. Like teams have come to understand a lot more around like not just like the security models of bridges themselves, which unfortunately have not actually improved that much, but in the surrounding infrastructure is just a lot better. Like I remember back in 2020 and 2021, like a lot of the work that we were putting into building this stuff was just around like how can we make sure that the chains themselves are actually like robust. Like at the time we would see like reorgs on Polygon that were hundreds of blocks deep, and like you'd have all of these like issues where like a chain would just completely go down. And like I remember in 2021 we like discovered this issue with like Phantom where it was Phantom had not actually built in like spam protection into their mempool, so it was possible to accidentally just spam their mempool infinitely, and then that could take down the entire chain, right? Like that's like a real DDoS risk. And so yeah, like things like that were everywhere because this whole space was just not ready yet, and that has changed, which is really good. I would say, unfortunately, some things have not changed as much. I mentioned like security models in general. Like we started out with like multi-sig bridges, and then there ended up being just like more consecutive narratives on multi-sig bridges. I think the optimistic model was something that was like quite promising as a way to like mitigate some of the trade-offs of it, or at least like improve some of the trade-offs of that. But that didn't take off as much as I think people expected it to, or as much as we wanted it to, just because I think after Nomad, like there was just a lot of like confusion in the space for a bit. And then intents, of course, like are another sort of security model. Though at the end of the day, like the intents are themselves secured by the underlying messaging. So they intents did some sort of abstract away the security for the users a little bit, which is nice. But under the hood, everything is still running not in the most like trustless way, right? Like what we need is proofs. Short of like very very large validator sets, which are very expensive, we need proofs. And so
Mhm.
I'm very excited by the direction that things are going with Succinct, for instance. I think like proving we'll get to the point where it's good enough that we can actually like put our money where our mouth is and have like really really good security for all this stuff in a way where it's not explicitly trading off user experience, which has been the problem in the past. Um, yeah, I would say. I mean, I think those are kind of my like the high level trends I've seen.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's anything else that you think is like interesting to point out there.
I mean, like, I feel like you literally touched on all the different talking points in the ecosystem today. I feel like a few years ago, security was a much bigger topic, but we've kind of shied away from talking about it now. It is just an accepted fact at this point. I'm not sure how to feel about it, but like,
Yeah,
how do you feel about it today? Because I remember like in the first few years, security was the thing to talk about, right? Like because you said there were so many hacks, everyone would just talk about security when it would come to bridges, and then there was like a lot of work being done, but probably because it was the early days of bridging. But then
yeah,
the conversation shifted from security to user experience. So, suddenly, like everyone was just talking about making things faster, and then like nobody was talking about security.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think to be honest, I mean that this has been like, it's been a huge learning lesson. I think for the whole space. Like I've talked to so many people in this whole space who are like, yeah, like it's kind of crazy the way that the attitude of the space has changed over the last few years. It's kind of capitulated to an extent, right? Like a lot of the why did we start working on all this stuff? Why did we start working on blockchains? It was because of like a kind of key belief that if you were to build systems that are trust minimized and non-custodial, that we can remove the need to have both as much kind of like as much of the like problematic aspects of like regulatory oversight, like for example the inefficiency that is created by needing to have very very complex reporting, as well as the need to like have single trusted intermediaries that could get hacked or go down or whatever, right? And so of course security is like this very nuanced topic, and I think a lot of people think about like hacks and stuff like that security, but I think like the big thing that has changed is really like the perception of economic security. Back in like 2019, right, like everyone was like, yes, economic security is super super important, this stuff has to be trustless. Everyone, it was just like the culture of the space was to hold everybody to this extremely high standard, right? If you built something like, I remember when we were building a lot of like our early layer 2 technology, and when we built our early implementations of Connext, like when we released stuff, we would give like an itemized list of every single possible like way that this could get compromised either by us or by somebody else, right? Like that, like every sort of way that we could rug users, and then our plan for how we would solve those things. And it was just, that was standard for every organization to try to do something like this, and then you had to expect to be called out if you didn't, because that was just also like the way that the space operated. But at the same time, like there's also something to be said about like making sure that this is usable, right? And that was the big trade-off space that we ran into, and that I think Interop ran into in 2021, where it was like, well, at the end of the day, like obviously users don't care about trust minimization. They don't care about decentralization, obviously, right? Like in the same way that like, yeah, like users don't care about like high fructose corn syrup because they don't know and they don't have another option. Like that's like, so there's a certain element of like like corporate responsibility, and then there's a certain element of like making sure you build a product that users want. And like I think what happened was that the pendulum kind of swung really hard in the other direction, where people were like, well, look, like at the end of the day, like is it better to spend a bunch of time like working on this technology trying to figure out the right way to build it, or is it better to like deliver value to the user? And it's a really good question. I do now feel a lot more like delivering value to the user is just much much more important. I do think that there is a way to kind of thread that needle better, or at least be more transparent and upfront about it. But I think like the projects that kind of ended up taking the strategy of, hey, we're just not really going to care that much about trust minimization, we're just going to work on like first work on just like solving this problem and then figure out that part later, they just did a lot better at the end of the day, right? Despite like despite the pushback that received, despite the fact that like there might be philosophical decision differences as to like why some people think that's right and some people don't. At the end of the day, the fact of the matter is that those things did better. And I think that's true, unfortunately, for the whole space. Like, there's a
I mean,
reason why like
it's a
custodial
go-to-market
rollups are
strategy
everywhere.
at this point, right? Like you see it in chains, you see it in every category, pretty much.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like the classic meme of like the crypto in the past and then crypto today. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the unfortunate reality is like we have, as an industry, we created a very perverse set of incentives associated with taking on VC funding early on in these projects, and like in under that paradigm, like we are just all incentivized to compete and grow as fast as possible, and like that is not conducive to an outcome where you're also thinking about some of these other things, like how can we build things the right way. Right, like it's not we had this hypothesis that maybe we could use VC funding to fund public goods, and that turned out to be totally false. What ended up happening was that the things that we were building as public goods ended up becoming corporations, which is fine, right? Like they're still useful and important, but yes, like that thesis I think has kind of failed, which is sad for the space.
Do you feel if the Nomad hack did not happen, things would look a little bit different today? Because I feel like there was one camp that was heavily invested into that design, right? Like it had the mind share, it had everyone bought in pretty much. But then
Yeah.
like the hack happened and then like nobody talked about it anymore.
Yeah, yeah. There was a very, very interesting cultural shift that happened after the Nomad hack, where like all of the projects that we were talking to, like Aave, Uniswap, and others, everyone basically, I think at that point gave up on bridging.
Mhm.
But when that happened, everyone was like, you know what? I just don't think this is going to work anymore. Like, we're just not going to do anything. We're either people were either like, we're going to build it in house, or they were like, we're just going to ignore this for this next couple of years because like it's just too much risk and like it doesn't seem like anybody's doing it right. And that was also where like all of the if you remember, that was like kind of the dark era of bridging as well, where like that was where everybody was really fighting each other a lot, and that was where all the projects on Twitter and everyone was always just like, yeah, like the interop space is just like this
It was a
really,
joke pretty
really,
much.
yeah, everybody, it's just like this really like immature kind of like fight all the time between all of these projects are not able to like produce anything meaningful. And yeah, that was unfortunate, right? I think like what should have happened was I think like this was driven a lot by incentives, right? You had a lot of projects that raised a lot of money, and like if you raise a huge amount of money, you're put into a situation where you now need to like figure out how to capture such a huge part of the market that you can't, you're like just not incentivized to collaborate with people, right? And so like even in a market where there's no traction and like it's early enough that like everybody should be working together to figure out how to grow the market, you are not incentivized to be a person that's like playing that game. And that's not, I mean, I don't think that's anyone's fault. I think that's just like the unfortunate reality of like how funding structures work. And this again gets to like, well, like why is it that this happened in Interop? Why didn't this also happen like for early chain development, right? So like why was this level of like race to the bottom aggressive competition not like why did it not exist for like early Turing complete chains? It kind of did, right? But not as much. And I think the reason was just like all of those chains like Ethereum and even stuff like EOS and whatever, right? Like they all raised in ICOs. And so if you were a person that like really believed in a certain ecosystem, you could go and just like take a position in that ecosystem and then go build on top of it. And it was like sometimes better to do that than it was to like raise and build your own project, because like at the end of the day, like getting mindshare around the thing that you were doing was a lot of work, and like there's no reason to not collaborate. You could be a part owner in this thing. But in this world where like everybody started being like much more private and doing like token sales much later, or token launches much later, there was no real way to like share in the upside of an organization, and so there was no incentive to collaborate with them anymore. Which is
the VC funding angle, like I feel like that's not new to crypto, right? Like of course every tech company works like this, and then like interestingly, tech companies actually become revenue generating or like profitable only after 10, 11 years, right? So do you feel in crypto there's this expectation of companies becoming profitable earlier or like dominating the market earlier? That's why there's this sort of a pressure being built up on teams to deliver in a way.
Yeah, to be clear, very few tech companies take 10 years to become profitable. Most of them get profitable within the first like couple of years, or at least like generate revenue within the first couple of years, or they die. Like the bar for success for sustainability for traditional corporations is way higher. And like that's something that I think in crypto, like we were unfortunately pushed into a position where like nobody could no like I think everybody understands intuitively, like, yeah, revenue matters, right? Like that's how you build sustainability, obviously. But like we all had to like do this thing where because of, the SEC and because of the way that like, because of the lack of clarity within the space, we were all like, well, we can't have this thing be tied to cash flow, like the token be tied to cash flows. We had to kind of figure out some like indirect way that this token is like generating and accruing value in the network that is separate from like the cash flows that are going through the network. And I think that was just a lot of hoop jumping. And like, I think that hoop jumping resulted in an outcome that was actually categorically worse for users, because like now it was harder to evaluate which companies are doing better or worse, right? You couldn't be like, hey, here are the fundamentals of this thing. You're just like, how much hype does this thing have? And like, and at the end of, and like, because the whole thesis was like, okay, if it has enough hype and if it grows enough, then maybe they will figure it out, right? Which is not a great way to operate. So yeah, I mean, I think like while it's true that this is not a new model, I think like what ended up happening is that we wanted crypto to function in a way where the outcomes were going to be different than Web 2 and TradFi, right? But we did not, and like somewhat ironically, as an industry that is so obsessed with mechanism design, so obsessed with incentives, right? Like so much of what we do is centered around like we need to build the right incentive structures to create a certain outcome, right? Despite that, we did not actually create any sort of different incentive structures, any sort of different funding structures for organizations in this space. And so what happened was everybody at the end of the day has been incentivized to go in a certain direction, which is like to operate as traditional startups, right? And like traditional startups, like yes, are not incentivized to like collaborate with other people. They're not incentivized. They're like very, very much incentivized to keep things closed off. They're very much incentivized to like move fast and break things. And not worry as much about like how is this stuff going to work? Is it going to be safe for users? Instead, be like, you know what, we're just going to grow as fast as possible. And if it fails, it fails, right? And look, like I don't, I'm not. That's not to say that that model is not good. Like I do really think the startup model is super, super effective. I think it obviously is, right? Like everything that we use today has been built with that model. But it isn't perhaps the best way to build public goods. And like that's something that I think was very important to the space in the past, but has become less so as people have kind of been like, okay, well, we don't really have another way to like raise capital to be able to do stuff, and so we maybe should not care as much about public goods anymore.
Mhm. I feel like how you explain the incentive structures, if you look at what's being traded today, it's literally stuff that's being traded on attention, right? Like meme coins
Yeah,
go to billions. So it's literally just attention. And then there's a
yeah,
new category in crypto called InfoFi, which is just monetizing attention. So I feel like
yeah.
how if you go
It's like
through
it's like a
yeah.
derivative on the attention of a project, which is hilarious. It's so funny. Only crypto could find a way to financialize itself.
Yeah, exactly. And then even from a distribution perspective, adoption perspective, like if you work on getting attention for your protocol, like there's a natural way to get distribution, right? So everything is incentivized towards building your own like attention flywheel.
Yeah, exactly. And and usually at the cost of like it's like oftentimes that is at the cost of actually doing something that is important for users, right? So it's like it is like right now the incentives in this space greatly reward projects that do build the like bare minimum shittiest product that they can, but instead just like aggressively generate a lot of attention around it, versus projects that actually build like a really, really good and successful product, and that is actually like that's not to say like, oh, like you shouldn't market, and that's also not to say that like um, like you can kind of recognize, right, like the projects that are not marketing as much or not playing this attention game, or like our post token launch, for instance, but are still growing, and like are still generating revenue and still have like positive unit economics. Like those are the things to pay attention to, because those are the projects that have actually found PMF, right? But the
Mm.
problem is that the current model doesn't actually incentivize going after that process, and finding PMF is the really, really hard thing. Instead, it incentivizes like generating a lot of attention as part of a token launch, because that is the actual like financial liquidity event, right? And like I think I disagree with like I think a lot of people, like a lot of like retail has gotten very burned, and so a lot of people are very disillusioned with the space, which is why I think meme coins are really obviously like very interesting for people, right? Um, so, but I disagree with them in that like, okay, like all of this stuff is scammy, and I think on the whole, generally, people are not intentionally trying to like rug by prioritizing only generating value from the token and not from like creating the underlying product. But like incentives are incentives, right? Like if you have an entire field of competition, and everyone's financial outcomes depends on how well their tokens do, and not how well the underlying product functions, everybody's like forced to compete on that one thing, right? And so
Yeah.
anybody that goes and builds a better product, like at the end of the day, like they're not as likely to win once everyone is like sort of just like, it's sort of the kind of, I don't know, I don't want to like name names here, but they're sort of like the strategy that some projects have used, and this is on the Interop side, it's on the chain side, it's on the application layer side, right? There's some projects that have basically like not focused as much on building a product, but have generated a lot of traction with something that is like less secure or whatever. Use that as like a launching pad to like launch a token and generate like huge cash treasury, and then gone and like
Mhm.
acquired other teams that are building things the right way, right? And so the incentives are kind of perverse there, where it's like if you build a product that's actually generating revenue and functioning, your outcome is that you're going to get acquired by someone that happened to generate enough hype. If you generate enough hype, you make so much more money, which is like interesting. It doesn't reward builders in the right way.
Yeah, so I also want to talk about, of course, intents. I feel like
Yeah.
Connext was definitely one of the first teams to actually have that design in production, right? Like I remember reading the docs back then, and then the words used were similar, and then like how you described it was pretty similar. But then, like for some reason, it did not take off. So today the intent-based design has become the default design in the bridging space, right? Like every bridge that launches has the intent-based design at its core. How do you see this development? Because like
Yeah.
you built something 4 years ago that had a similar design, but it did not take off for XYZ reasons. But like today, everyone looks at intents as this like magic pill for UX for the entire crypto ecosystem.
Yeah. There's a few reasons. So when we built, when we built kind of like the first implementation of Connext in like 2020, 2021, that used a technology called state channels to fill transactions across chains. And state channels are basically like a form of intent. They're like a long-lived off-chain intent. And we were just using them in a very short-lived way where we're creating a channel, filling a transaction, and closing it, which is effectively exactly how intents work today. We even launched like a newer protocol on top of that basically then implemented an RFQ system. And it was almost exactly the way this stuff works today. And it worked. It actually worked really well. We grew insanely fast. The main bottleneck for us was actually just capital. Like we were running our own internal solver, and like that had like all of our team's capital in it. And that thing was like we were basically like turning over all of the capital in that solver. I think we had like 500K worth of capital because we didn't have a lot of money at the time. We had like 500K to $1 million worth of capital, and like we were turning that over like I think it was like 10 times a day at least. Right. And so which is crazy. And so, I think at the time, like it was definitely, we were certainly like one of the biggest bridges at the time. But then there were some challenges that we ran into. One of the big challenges compared to things like multi-sig bridges was like, hey, this is just technology that requires like a bit more work, right? Like we don't have this really simple notion of like, hey, this is a totally custodial thing and we're just like releasing funds here and taking it here. It was like hey, like we have to play this actual like trust minimization game. We have to build a sophisticated like relay implementation and stuff like that. So the problems we were running into were like those pieces where we had to build a relayer that was like going to be like what we called a router at the time that was going to be like filling transactions very consistently on the target chain. And like that relied on a bunch of other dependencies that just were not sophisticated yet, right? The other thing that we ran into, and this is the problem that everyone has run into, and this is the reason that Everclear exists, is rebalancing. Rebalancing was like the biggest problem every single, like we had eventually with our second kind of version, our like V1 protocol, which was called NXTP, we decentralized the like router ecosystem as a way to start scaling up liquidity. And I think in retrospect, we maybe did this prematurely. We should have actually just like kept it super centralized and like just grown our own liquidity first, and then like just work through it, right? Because that's been like what Across and others have done, and it's worked quite well. And then only decentralized as we kind of like got more understanding of the underlying problems. But the reason that we didn't do this was one, because we were like we were decentralization maxis at the time, and then two, because we just didn't see another great way to like scale to generate a lot of capital, like cash flows, right? Like we were kind of an underdog, and so we were like, how do we get like $50 million of TVL really quickly? And this was how we just like decentralized, and we got a bunch of like staking service providers and other people to start running routers. And all of them, we found that out of the like $50 million in TVL that the protocol had, maybe about like 2 was actually being used actively all the time, because everybody else was just getting stuck in like rebalancing stuff. And so that's actually like that was a huge problem then. That is still a huge problem now. The reason that it is less of a problem now is that back then there were frequently on many paths no ways to rebalance, literally zero, like right, because there were no exchange integrations, there were no canonical bridges, there were no other bridges that were servicing those pathways, right? So like it was like we could go and fill a transaction, but then like to get back or to rebalance, like you had to go and use some other like obscure bridge like multi-chain or whatever, and then like multi-chain would get stuck for like 8 hours or something, and then you'd be like, okay, well I don't know what to do now. And so I think it was just hard to be able to provide the level of service that exists today. Whereas right now, when you look at what like Across and Relay and others are doing, right, they're going and using like Binance, they're going and using like they're using other bridges, right? They're all using each other, and on top of that, they're using like canonical bridges and stuff like that. And so I think the infrastructure has just gotten a lot better. So like the bar for success has kind of come down to a more reasonable point at this point, but it's not all the way down. And like this is the reason why Everclear exists, and like the reason that we kind of came up with this was after. So if you look at kind of all the versions that we released, right, it was all just iterations on how do we solve this rebalancing problem. It was like initially we were like, okay, we released this like basic intent-based system, and then we started figuring out, okay, well maybe we can use like Nomad under the hood to like send messages to like rebalance flows between chains. And then when that didn't work, we were like, okay, maybe we can do a hop-like model where there's actually pools on each chains, and then we like synchronize those pools. And then that didn't work, and we were like, okay, maybe we can try this out. And so and then at the end of the day, like about a year and a half ago, we were kind of thinking through, well, what comes next, right? Like, how do we actually make this, like, everybody's heading towards intents. How do we make this actually like sophisticated enough that either we compete or we can like work with other people? And I was just like, I genuinely don't think there's a solution to this problem, because at the end of the day, the rebalancing problem is the fragmentation problem, right? It is fundamentally the same thing. And it's just the fact that like it is just work to move funds between chains. And so what we kind of realized was like, well, maybe like the only real way to do this is to like reduce the amount of funds that are moving between chains in the first place. And that was the kind of Everclear thesis.
I mean, I think I remember one story where I feel like because you guys were running your solver and you were maybe using Jumper, like you came into the LI.FI Connext group chat and you were like, this bridge is taking too long. Like, do you know if there's a known delay or something? And then at that moment in my head, it clicked where I was like, okay, this does not scale, right? Like if Arjun has to come into the chat to ask another team if this bridge is actually working or not to actually rebalance in the end, like how do we do this for 100 chains, and then how do we do this for a lot of users and a lot of order flow? So I feel like in my head at that point I was like, intents are great, but then like this does not scale at all. So I feel like the Everclear move, as you rightly said, the rebalancing problem is the biggest problem in general, right? So that's the right bet, but do you feel like it is the right timing this time around, whereas like Connext might have been a little bit earlier than the market?
Yeah, I don't. So I don't think Connext was too early. I think actually Connext was really well timed. I think the problem with Connext, the mistake, we made a bunch of mistakes with Connext. I think one of the mistakes that we made was that I didn't really want to build a consumer facing project. That was never Connext's thesis. The consumer facing bridge that was built on top of Connext was literally like pulled out of us, right? Like we had random community members hack together a bridge, and then people just started using it. That was like that ended up being like the biggest application. And there's like lots of like fun history lesson for everybody that listens to this. So like in 2021, Connext like started to take off a lot. And the reason that we started to take off was that we had we've been like we were a B2B project at the time. We were trying to work with a bunch of different players in the market, like Polymarket and OneHive and a bunch of other orgs. And like generally speaking, bridging market was super early. We were really focused on like Polygon, Gnosis Chain, and Binance Chain because those were like really the only chains that existed at the time, aside from Ethereum, of course. And so we started trying to talk to these projects, and like OneHive, which was this like DAO on top of Gnosis Chain, was like, hey, this is actually kind of interesting. Maybe we can use this to help people swap on our AMM. And I was like, yes, absolutely. In fact, you can even, at the time, we already had like the across plus integration of like, you can go and execute call data on the target chain. We actually already had that because we built it for our state channel stuff before. So I was like, in fact, what you can even do is create a totally chain abstracted AMM back in 2021. And they like gave them the designs for it. And they're like, okay, this is really, really cool. It's blowing our minds. We don't really know how. So like what we're going to start with is a really simple application where we just first send stable coins between chains, and then we then we'll integrate that into our AMM. And I was like, okay, great. And they created this application. I think they deployed it to a Vercel link. It was called like xdai polygon bsc.vercel.app, and then they just like posted it on Twitter, and it went absolutely viral. And immediately I was like, guys, like you can't have this like link. People are going to get scammed. You need to like buy a domain. And they're like, well, we don't know what this is. I bought them a domain. I bought them xpollinate.io because it was cross-pollinate, which was kind of in the same theme as their B related stuff for OneHive. And that application actually ended up being like 99% of our volume for a while, because as it turns out, consumer bridging was the thing that had PMF, right? It wasn't necessarily like B2B bridging because the space was early for that. And then eventually we kind of found like, okay, well, like, the OneHive team didn't necessarily have the resources to take this forward. They were also not as interested in like owning this product as like its own product. They wanted it to be something that we owned, but we also, as was common at the time, like no protocol wanted to own the interface because of like legal risks and stuff like that. And so we actually went and talked to LI.FI. At the time, there were two founders, Philip and Max, who had been building like in a hackathon with Connext. And we went to those founders and we were like, guys, like, would you like to own this going forward? Like, you could just be the canonical UI for bridging on top of Connext, and you can go and like work with other projects too if you want. But like, we just want someone to own this. And like Philip was like, yeah, for sure. And so then LI.FI took over the like xpollinate project. And yeah, I remember the like UI had sort of like the ticks as it went through each step.
That was the first bridge I ever used. I feel like that was the first bridge for everyone in the ecosystem.
Yeah. And then, and like as time went on, this sort of like continued. And at the end of the day, everyone was like, look, like we don't want to we want to go and build our own application. We want to go do something. And like everyone eventually we kept kind of coming to the same thing of like, hey, 99% of our volume is coming from consumer bridging. We kind of have to own the consumer app. So eventually we brought it in-house as the Connext bridge. And I hated that. I did not want that at all. I didn't think that there was any defensibility on consumer bridging. I still don't, by the way. At the time, I was like, consumer bridging is stupid. I still think this. It was like, consumer bridging is stupid because consumer bridging is just swapping on a DEX, right? Like why are you bridging? Like you're bridging because you want to get to an application. You should just integrate into the application. There's no reason to have this notion of bridging in the first place. It's so strange.
It's just an
Um,
exchange on two different chains.
exactly, yeah. And so I was like, I think the consumer bridging space is just going to get killed by Uniswap. Why? I don't want to compete with Uniswap. So like let's just build the infrastructure. And so we tried to build this like B2B application platform. And unfortunately, and so did a lot of other people, right? Like Layer Zero tried to do this, Wormhole tried to do this, Axelar tried to do this, and we all failed. Every single one of us just failed to build a lot of applications, like custom applications that were cross-chain. And I think a big part of the reason for this was just like people weren't building really super interesting stuff. Like everybody was sort of like struggling to find PMF themselves. And so like eventually, especially after the market crash in 2022, people were like, the most of the projects we were talking to were like, well, we're having a hard time even finding users. So like the Interop stuff is like less important to us. And so, yeah, like I think this was a big part of the reason that we kind of like things didn't go in the direction we wanted to. Like we should have actually in retrospect doubled down on consumer bridging. And I think if we had done that, things might have been quite different. But I think everybody ended up making that mistake, right? And it wasn't until the second wave of consumer bridges came along, like Across and others, where they were like, yeah, you know what, we're just going to do consumer. We're not going to worry about the developer facing stuff. That like things kind of just started to change a little bit.
I think even for LI.FI, it was a similar conversation for the first
Yeah,
10 months, I guess. Like LI.FI is still a B2B company, but then there were a lot of discussions internally where one side of the team would make the case for, no, we need a B2C app, or we need to put more emphasis on it. Like we need to put more resources behind it. And then thankfully, like Jumper was born because of that. And then like the whole consumer shift happened. So I totally get your point. But then if you
yeah,
look at the chunk of the volumes, like it's still not on the interfaces, right? Like
yeah.
and then there's no defensibility, there's no moat, like people
There's
just move
not.
from one interface to another. Sure, there's probably a convenience and like a habit, but then like habits change literally in 21 days, like that. There's
Yeah,
uh, age old research that shows it. So I don't know, like
yeah,
that, I feel like there's no moat on the front end level, but it's still very important. Like how else do you take off, like how else do you show that your tech actually works if you do not have your own application, or if
yeah.
you don't have like one flagship application that can show your tech works, right?
Yeah. And look, like I think like there are a lot of lessons here, right? Like I as a founder, I have grown. I mean, this is 2021. It was like 5 years ago, 4 years ago, right? I've grown a lot in that time. I've learned a lot about. That was my first time finding PMF. I learned a lot about like what it means to find PMF and how to capture it, and then how to like win with it. Since then, and like I think this is very common for a lot of first time founders that like you should for most of the time you find PMF and then like you either find PMF and then you're lucky that it like sort of carries you to the point where you can then like figure it out, or most of the time what happens is that you just lose it, right? You sort of like make the wrong decisions and you lose it. PMF exists as just this like ephemeral thing that exists for a short period of time and it disappears. I think the right strategy for anybody that was in this space at the time should have actually been go to market with a consumer application, don't get hacked. That was like the really really big one. And just like provide a really good consumer experience for like a small number of chains, for as like on a regular basis as consistently as possible with using as much like as little liquidity as possible for as long as you can, and then only branch out to developer now, right? Like I think even now it's still like early
Still
for
early,
developer
yeah.
facing. Yeah, exactly. And so like I think like to be honest, almost nobody really did that. I think Across was really the only one that actually did that. And at the time, I think I for a while was like, well, I don't know if the Across model is going to work because like why would people use the bridge UI? But I think it has, because I think people still think of bridging as this thing, this individual action.
Yeah.
Um, and now Across is branching out into like developer facing, which is good. I'm happy that that's happening.
I feel like the users in crypto, me included, like we have a very binary way of thinking, right? Like, okay, I want to swap,
Yeah,
I'll go to this interface and then do this action. So it's still very much the same user behavior. Maybe it changes when chains become like less important, but I don't know, like if I look at an app, my first question instinctively is still like, okay, which chain do
yeah,
I need to have funds on to actually use it, right? Like it probably changes in a year or so, I guess,
yeah,
with chain abstraction, but it's still the case where most of the users are still thinking, okay, I have my funds on Ethereum and then I'm gonna do my meme coin trading on Solana, I'm gonna trade perps on Hyperliquid. So it's very like chain specific actions and like very specific actions. So like you mentioned the rebalancing problem for Everclear, right? Like that's sorry for Connext that you ran into, and then with Everclear you kind of double down on that problem. So you of course see that as one of the major hurdles for bridging and like intends to kind of take off, right? So,
yeah.
how did you come up with the clearing concept? I mean, I know it's not a new concept, like it exists in the financial world for sure. But like, why did you think like, okay, this is the right bet for the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. So part of it was that it was just years of time that I was like brushing up against this problem, right? Like we encountered this problem 3 years before anybody else did. And like spent those 3 years basically like trying to muscle through different ways to solve it and figuring out like, hey, there aren't really good ways to solve it, right? And then I eventually tried to solve it with like unified token standard, XERC20. And that was actually the main reason that I wanted XERC20 to exist. Is like I think there was always this narrative of like, well, Connext wants to do this because they benefit from it or whatever. And it's like a token standard similar to like a lot of the other things that existed, like OFTs and stuff like that. But it really wasn't. Like it was the goal was really just like try to find some unified way to send these things across chains, so that way we as in like Connext and anybody else that requires rebalancing, which now as it turns out literally every single bridge requires some amount of rebalancing, right? So anybody that requires rebalancing, like we just have an easier time, and like we don't have to we're not like bottlenecked by that problem for the rest of like the space's history. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, right? And I think that was also like a really interesting lesson that like the entrenched interests of a bunch of different organizations are going to lead to fragmentation. And so the two solutions that I had were like, okay, we try to solve the fragmentation. By the way, this thought process exactly mirrors the discussions that have happened more recently around like interoperability standardization. It's just really hilarious. Everyone's like, well, why don't we just like all consolidate on the same deposit contracts and the same standards? And like, that was exactly what I was like. Well, why don't we just consolidate on the same deposit contracts and same standards?
I was thinking the same thing. Like I've seen this movie before. It does not work out
Exactly.
like this.
It doesn't. Yeah. And as we have found out, like it hasn't worked out, right? Like nobody has been able to consolidate on a single standard. Even now with like the EF pushing for something, everyone's still kind of like fragmented. And it's just again, it's incentives at the end of the day, right? Like people have slightly different incentives there. And so with Everclear, I was like eventually I got so frustrated at the end of like 2023 after like XRC20 kind of like went out and this controversy quiz created around it, and like I had been talking about like chain abstraction at that point, and I got so frustrated because I was like, well, we're not going to be able to solve this problem unless like we actually solve rebalancing. But like nobody seems to care about actually solving fragmentation. Everybody seems only to care about like making their own token price go up, which is like, I get it, but also like it doesn't, like none of us have a market if we don't solve this, right? And so I started thinking a little bit about like, okay, well, what if we lean into the worldview that everything is just going to remain fragmented, right? Like that there is no solution to fragmentation, which I think over time we've kind of come to the conclusion that there really isn't. If there is no solution to fragmentation, how do you make this problem less problematic? And the answer is like, okay, well, if bridging is always going to be painful for people who want to rebalance, why don't you just bridge a lot less? Right. And the kind of click happened when I was like looking at, I was basically like, I had made a list of all of the different ways that you could do settlement in an intent protocol, right? So there's the traditional way to do settlement that we have today is like the intent protocol unlocks back to the solver on the source chain, and I called that reverse settlement in my research. But there's also a bunch of other ways, right? Like you could have a liquidity pool on the target chain and like and on the source chain, and this is kind of like how HOP works, right? Like and then the solver goes and fills, and then you also send a message in parallel that is like a slow path message, and after a couple of hours that like repays the solver. So that is a forward settlement. And then there's a bunch of other things, right? And so what I kind of realized was like, well, you could actually you could actually like mix these different models by having it like an intermediate chain where like you're sometimes forward settling to and sometimes reverse settling to make sure that the liquidity stays. And as I kind of went on and on doing that, I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. Like what I'm describing here is just a chain. It's just clearance. It's just like a single system where everybody's just putting all their flows and then we're just netting them off against one another, right? And so it came out emergently from that. And then I was like, holy shit, this is actually just how normal finance works. You're just re-deriving finance from first principles.
It's like, so Mark and I, we have a joke that like this is a crypto bro figuring out how finance works and then
Exactly.
for the first time.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, oh my God, I'm brilliant. You write a paper and then people are like, yeah, we've been doing this for like 100 years.
Yeah.
But clearance is a really, really important thing. Like it's, if you look at those, that was when I started to do a deep dive into like, okay, well, how do clearinghouses work? And like, why is clearance important? And like, so clearance as a concept didn't really exist until I think it was like the 1960s, 1970s. And before that, like when you traded stocks on like the New York Stock Exchange, right, you actually traded stock certificates. So like when you executed a trade at the end of the day for settlements, like they would actually send around all these stock certificates.
There would be a paper, basically.
Insane, right? Yeah. The New York Stock Exchange actually resisted adopting a clearinghouse for a time because like, a clearinghouse would have just required a lot of coordination from everyone to be like, everyone has to buy into the system, right? And nobody really wanted to do that. So they resisted adopting this. And someone actually built a renegade clearinghouse. That was like a private company. They just built their own clearinghouse in New York Stock Exchange, and they were just clearing some subset of the market. And that started growing so fast that the New York Stock Exchange actually had to step in and be like, okay, you know what, we can't like almost like a lot of the volume is going through this thing. We need to like blacklist this and we need to build our own because this is insane. And that was how like the first kind of like clearance systems came out, which is really cool.
Makes sense. I mean, I've also read, like, I think someone from your team also posted about the visa story and how the
Yeah,
whole coordination happened through, I don't
yeah,
know, giving out incentives through the stake in the company. So I felt like that was an interesting history lesson there. Like, that's one topic that I would probably want to go deeper into. Like, I
yeah,
recently did a deep dive into like how money works in these current system, like Swift, all the different rails, and then compare it to like crypto rails. So I felt like
yeah,
that was a very good history lesson for me, just understanding how money works traditionally, and then how crypto is just better, right? Like if I want to send money to someone in the US, I can just like use crypto so easily, and then my bank makes me go through 5 processes just to access my own money. So it's like
yeah,
worlds apart, and there's like so many hurdles, so much more fees. So I feel like
yeah.
the clearing angle would have a similar story, and that's something that I would love to like dive deeper into, and then do kind of a similar story with Everclear as the crypto example.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about Visa because I think that's a really really good example, right? So how does Visa actually work? So when you do payments, right? Like payments between banks are quite a complex thing because the bank actually has to like wire money to another bank, and how banks wire money and how that's settled is like a very complex process. It involves going through like jurisdictional interchanges where so like the bank basically has to say like, okay, I have money here. I'm going to reduce like my finances in this account, and you need to go and increase it on another account, right? And the like there has to be there's like checks and balances against this to make sure that the banks have the reserves to do it and things like that. And then it also has to go through like jurisdictional like interchanges that are basically like in Europe there's like an interchange that then registers this transaction and then like tells then tells like the interchange in the US, and so there's this like whole coordination process where everybody has their own like ledger and they all have to like go and update all of these things in series, and that's why it just takes a long time, right? Like wires take like at least a full business day because each bank is just like processing this manually using humans. And obviously this is why blockchains are better, right? Like obviously. But in both cases, right? Like it's not instant. It's not like this transaction happens immediately. And in blockchains, like it's fast enough most of the time. So in the case of Bitcoin, right, it's like slow enough that you still need something that's sitting on top that is like making these transactions happen a lot faster. And for Ethereum, it's like fast enough that that's probably like reasonable. But for cross chain, it's still again you run into the same problem. It's like slow enough and complex enough that you need something sitting on top of this to make these transactions happen. So in traditional payments, how this works is with payment providers like Visa, right? Visa basically started out. So like when Visa first started out, there was a bunch of different banks that were starting card payment programs, and the goal behind this, they were all like rolling out POS systems, and the goal behind this was like create a simpler way for people to do digital payments without having to either like wire funds or like write checks, right? Because like that doesn't really work for retail. And so banks wanted to get rid of like retail cash handling as much as possible and like move towards digitization. And so they created this notion of cards where like the card allows you to debit funds from a bank account, or you can just like pay using credit and then repay the bank later. Every bank started creating their own card programs, and it was Bank of America, and their subsidiary Bank of America was the one that was like, hey, like we should actually not create a bunch of different protocols for this, but instead like create a single unified protocol that everybody can work with. We can go into how they did that in a second. The way that Visa works is when you go and you pay at a payment POS terminal, Visa basically creates a commitment. So they say, hey, like I know that this merchant was paid. They go and they create a commitment to the merchant that like, hey, you're going to get paid for this amount. I have registered this transaction. And then later on during the day, Visa takes all of the transactions that have happened in the day and they consolidate those transactions and they create a set of settlement instructions. So what that consolidation is effectively clearing, right? So like say like you're a merchant that is using like Bank of America and I'm a merchant that's using Chase. And like a bunch of people transact to me and then a bunch of people transact to you, but then there's also a bunch of transactions that are going in the opposite direction, right? So like going from Chase to Bank of America and then Bank of America to Chase, right? And what Visa does is it takes all of those transactions and like nets them all down to the point where there's just a final delta between each bank. And at the end of the day, each day, they create settlement instructions where they go to all these banks and say, hey, you need to update these accounts and their balances. You need to update these accounts and their balances. And the banks just trust Visa with this, right? They're like, yeah, whatever you guys say goes here. Like, Visa's a bit of a cabal. Not everybody loves them, but it is it's a working system. And the reason that this works is because basically Visa Visa's instantly clearing the payment, instantly making this transaction happen, and then they're dealing with all the complexity on the back end to reduce how much it costs to do settlement. They make a bunch of money on doing this effectively, and that's where their network exists. For crypto, like on a single chain, like with Bitcoin, right? The way that this worked was with like the Lightning Network, right? You have like Lightning nodes, and those Lightning nodes like clear transactions with each other, so they're instant, and then they have a one-to-one relationship with each other. And so like if you send $5 this way and I send $3 this way, then like the total net difference is $2. And then at the end of the day, when you settle your Lightning Network channel, right, you're settling on the Bitcoin blockchain for $2. You've paid tons and tons of transaction fees to settle $2, which is a terrible idea. But and for cross chain, it's kind of similar, right? You have an intent solver, like you have an intent protocol like a cross. They go and they immediately fill the transaction on the target chain. Right, so the solver is now out of pocket, but the user has gotten paid. So it's like sort of like the user going to a merchant, right? The user's transaction is complete, and they're happy, and they get to go do whatever they want. The solver is the one that's kind of like on the hook, and the reason that solver role exists is because we don't have credit in this space. We could, in theory, allow solvers to operate on credit, and that's actually what some of the like liquidity pool mechanisms kind of do, which is interesting. But yeah, for now, the solver goes and fills it using their own capital, and then the solver gets repaid on another chain. And as part of that, so it's part of that step. So it's like two things, right? The solver gets repaid, and then they figure out how to get their money back to where it needs to belong. That is basically clearance and settlement. In crypto, just like in traditional, just like with Visa, there is an opportunity to take all of these solver transactions that are happening, all of the flows that are going between each chain, and just net them off. And what we found when we did like the research on this was that a very significant amount of this stuff does actually net off, right? Like if you look at the daily volume into and out of Arbitrum, like they're don't know exactly how much they're doing right now, but
I think like your initial announcement post said that you can basically clear 80% of the flows through this.
Exactly. So it's like if there's $100 million going into Arbitrum, there's on a given day, there's like probably $80 million coming out of it on that same day, which is interesting because it's like that's $180 million worth of bridging, but it's actually only $20 million worth of net bridging, which is a lot less. Yeah.
And then like in the early days or like in the last 6 months, 12 months, what have you seen? Like, is the netting thesis actually working? Because of course there's also a cold start problem, right? Like netting works better at economies of scale. So of course, like as you get more and more order flow, you'll see the benefits. So I want to know like what's your experience been with that in terms of data?
Yeah. So netting has existed and it existed before as well. Where the netting was existing was within people's accounts. So like solvers were basically netting off their own flows, right? So they're saying, hey, like I have made a transaction from Optimism to Arbitrum. I'm not going to rebalance this. I'm going to hold my funds here because I know that there's a decent to high chance that I'm going to get a transaction going back in the opposite direction. And so they just end up netting within their own capital. This works. It's obviously less efficient, right? Because you're going to find coincidences of once for yourself a lot less frequently than you would collaboratively with other people. So the big name of the game for us for the last like year, or I guess 9 months is going live, has been how do we figure out where those like nettable flows exist within people's wallets and then bring them into the system. And so the bootstrapping mechanism that we kind of figured out for that was like, well, we run our own solver in the system, and our own solver takes the kind of like time dependence of this stuff, where it's like we if there's a solver that rebalances at time 0 at like 2 p.m., right? Our solver goes and fills them immediately, so they have rebalanced, and then our solver just waits until someone's going the opposite direction and then goes in the opposite. So it's like we basically we are able to like use our capital as a way to mitigate the time dependency of netting. The other thing that we found is like the netting stuff really starts to kick in at higher scales, right? So a lot of it comes down to like how much flow exists in the system. And this is the cold start problem that you said. What we realized there was like, I mean, a lot of it just came down to like, well, how can we make sure that for the first few users, this is just like as good as possible? And so with any kind of like multi-sided marketplace, you usually, the way that you bootstrap is like you act as one side of the marketplace, right? So like, for instance, with Uber, right? When Uber was first starting out, like the team members were the ones that were the drivers because they just acted as the supply side of the market, right? Airbnbs, like, the team were actually like renting out the first Airbnbs themselves or staying in them, right? They were just like trying to bootstrap the market however they could. And so we've kind of been doing this where like we have our own solver that's like running and sort of taking the other side of this, of the market. But as things have gone on, we've found more and more that there are this like organic netting that's starting to happen just by itself within the system. And this is basically like as we've like crossed into like $100-200 million monthly range, that is where it's starting to pop up a bit more. And our current hypothesis is that like even right now, for instance, right, like our solver runs basically is like filling on Everclear, but we're also now having that same solver go and fill on Across and a bunch of other things. And the reason we're doing this is because we're finding, hey, if we were to fill on Everclear and then also fill on Across, we could net out like 90 something% of our flow, which is
Okay.
really interesting. And we could do this in our own solver for now, and then eventually we can migrate all of that into the same ledger, so everybody then has access to it, right? So it's like an interesting bootstrapping technique where we're sort of like capturing the netting that's happening in places, having it happen in our solver, and then we're then like we then like push it into the system by having our solver like create intents for all of the nettable flows that it has.
I mean, like you said, because I talk to a lot of bridge teams, right? So I know that literally one bridge is using the other bridge to
Yeah,
rebalance, and then they would use Jumper to find the best out. So I know that netting is happening, but then, like you said, it's a coordination problem, right? Like if
yeah,
all of us meet at the right place at the right time, then we can probably figure this out together. But then these things are happening in
yeah,
isolation. So how do you bring them all to your marketplace? And that's the challenge for Everclear today.
yeah.
Do you
The other
feel that?
piece of
Mhm.
this,
Go
actually,
on.
because you touched on this, but the other piece of this I think is also incentives. So like
Mhm.
for something like Everclear to work, it touches back to kind of what we talked about with with Visa, right? So
I was going to
for
talk about
something like
the incentives and coordination problem.
yeah, so like I think for something like this to really work well in the way that we want it to, right? Like it kind of needs to be like Visa. So what Visa did in the early days was really really interesting, and it was maybe like the first example of like a decentralized protocol in the way that we kind of think of it today, right? Where like the founder of Visa realized like the net value of creating like a coalition of different card programs that all operate under the same roof was so much higher than having a bunch of individual orgs, right? But then how do you make sure that everybody's incentivized to do this? And so what he did was really interesting. He like basically just like made the first like 50 banks or so like partners in the system, and like everybody got equity, and then Visa became this org that was like partly just owned by everybody, all of its constituents, and then partly its own independent organization, right? So for all of the banks, that changed the calculus. It was like, do I want to build my own competing system or find my own way to do this, or do I want to just like use the shared system that I have upside in, where the sum is going to be more than like individual parts, right? And we have kind of a similar philosophy. We have basically been like trying to find ways to give tokens to the different projects that are like using us through deals, through like incentive programs. There's like some stuff in our DAO that might be interesting to read there, because my goal is that like eventually Everclear should be owned by everybody that is using it, right? And that's like how protocol should work. Like protocol should be owned by their users. It should be owned by random people. Like it should be owned by our own, like the bridges that are using us, and those bridges should be able to collectively decide like, how will this thing function long term? What kinds of fees will it charge? How much of those fees should be rebated back to the bridges? Like, it's like almost like at that point, the fee is like less of a, hey, this is a fee for a project, and more of a like a collective tax that everybody's like opting into paying, right? And then that tax is like redistributed back to everybody, which is kind of interesting.
I love how this conversation has come like full circle in a way. We started from how people are building startups and not like true protocols anymore, and then you've gone on to describe everything about Visa and then like how Everclear is building it, and you have like these core properties that you really deeply care about, and then you're trying to
Yeah,
like make Everclear tick in the same direction in the long run. So I love that like closed loop of the conversation.
yeah, yeah. I think that was actually the big click for me last year. Was I was like, okay, I think the problem and the reason that I was getting like burnt out a lot, and a big part of the reason was that my own incentives were confused, right? My own incentives were broken. Where I was like, on the one hand, I was like, I really want to push for building public goods, for creating infrastructure that is actually helping everybody in the space, and that's helping like kind of helping basically like uplift the space and like move the space forward. And then that, of course, like I do think public goods can be valuable and can capture value. So of course, like capturing value for investors, but in addition to that, creating something that is like a net positive sum like thing, right? But I was finding that because we had so many competitors that were trying to do similar things, like everything that I was doing was naturally like I was sort of like forced into this like competition where we were forced into this competition where we were like having to operate as a startup, right? And and a part of the kind of like shift for us in mindset was like, well, by shifting to this like different position in the stack, by explicitly killing the bridge, right? Like we killed the bridge. We removed our own horse in this race. We put ourselves into this neutral position with everybody. We were like, look, like we're not competing with you. We don't want to compete with you. We want to work with you. And we want to work with everyone, and we want to be this neutral thing. Like by intentionally trying to go in that direction, I think we've like changed our incentives a lot. We're like, now we're operating as a startup where we're like, yeah, we have to work on growth and stuff like that. But it's interesting because like our incentives are very aligned with everybody, right? Like our incentives are help every intent protocol succeed, keep intents as like decentralized as possible, because the more decentralized it is, the more of a market we have, right? And try to ensure that bridges, like basically that like bridges don't get captured by like just that there isn't just like a single player that like wins everything, but there is like an open market of this stuff, and that like this entire industry gets like pushed forward and grows, which is really cool. Like I would say like in the past our incentives were certainly like try to make it so other bridges don't exist anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, I don't know. So in a way, you've now found the perfect way to keep yourself satisfied with the positioning that you have, but you've also built a protocol that's super important for the future of Interop, right? Like if Interop takes off, like if the volume 10x is from here, there's going to be so much more rebalancing that's needed, and then
Yeah.
naturally you will need a clearing there. So I really hope that works out. And there's just like so many things we can talk about right now that in Interop, like we haven't touched token standards at all. Like there's so many different topics. There's like AI and crypto, but I don't want to like take more of your time. So thanks a lot.
Okay. Good. Maybe a part two.
Yeah, exactly. So there's always another conversation. Thanks a lot for your time. I feel like this was a long overdue conversation, but I really feel good about the conversation. So thanks a lot for the time and taking us through your thoughts on the space, how Everclear fits in, and I really hope it does work out properly.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to come on here.
Awesome.